All right, why don't we go ahead and get started here? Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Morales, he, him, and I am from East Bay Democratic Socialists of America's Anti-Imperialism Committee. Welcome to our East Bay DSA Night School on Oswald Zavala's Drug Cartels Do Not Exist, Narco-Trafficking in U.S. and Mexican Culture. So we're doing things a little bit differently today. This is actually a post-event recording. As you can tell, it is not nighttime right now. We weren't able to record the night of the event, but given the recent developments in Texas at the border and given the larger nationwide response to these recent events, particularly around tensions with Mexico with regard to migration, and a lot of the propaganda that's been used around the drug crisis, we thought it would be good to get something out there for folks to listen to, especially those who weren't able to join us this last week. Okay, so one thing I do want to plug before we get started here, for those of you who are East Bay locals and aren't yet DSA members but want to get involved, please join our organization. We need your help in our anti-imperialist efforts and in our socialist mission at large. So you can go to eastbaydsa.org /join. We'll go ahead and try and get that link for you in the YouTube description for the video. We really can't do this without you, so please, if you do feel inspired by this video, join our cause. As I mentioned earlier, I am the co-chair of our anti-imperialist committee. Mexico is one of our many areas of international focus. Palestine is, of course, a primary area of focus as of recent, but there's so much more that we are trying to do and fight against. So please do consider joining. And if you are not a Bay Area local, but you do live in the United States, don't worry, we've got you covered. National DSA has its international committee. They've been doing some incredible work and organizing. You can check them out at international.dsausa.org and join there. And again, we'll try and provide you with the link in the description below. But with that all said, why don't we go ahead and get into it? Okay, so for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the history of Mexico's drug policies as outlined in this book. Then briefly tie it back to the underlying neoliberal and U.S. imperialist influences, also gathered from this book. And then I'm going to finally bring this all back to what we're seeing playing out today between U.S. and Mexico. So why don't we start with the main argument of this book and the meaning of the title, Drug Cartels Do Not Exist. Now, despite the evocative wording Zavala uses here, he is not claiming that the violence connected to narco-trafficking does not exist. And while he does argue that the violence is due more to state policing than the drug trafficking itself, the title is actually referencing something else entirely. The main thing he is challenging here is the idea of a Mexican drug cartel in the true sense of the word, cartel. So what technically is a cartel? While the word is often repeated in news and pop culture media accounts of drug trafficking, and while this has conditioned us to associate it with drug trafficking gangs, the actual meaning of the word is quite different. According to Oxford Dictionary, a cartel is an association of manufacturers or suppliers with the purpose of maintaining prices at a high level and restricting competition. Lenin defined cartels as playing a key role in the imperialist monopoly stage of capitalism. So to quote Lenin here, cartels come to an agreement on the terms of sale, dates of payment, etc. They divide the markets among themselves. They fix the quantity of goods to be produced. They fix prices. They divide the profits among the various enterprises, etc. Luis Astorga, sociologist and drug trafficking and national security policy expert, Zavala draws pretty heavily on him in this book. he emphasized a central contradiction to the concept of a drug trafficking cartel. And that is mainly that these trafficking groups rarely act in a unified manner to enhance profits. They're actually more like rivals constantly trying to wipe each other out. Colombian drug trafficker Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela stated the following about drug cartels, quote, "It is an invention of the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. There are many groups, not just one cartel. The police and the DEA know, but they prefer to invent a monolithic enemy." Now, the mainstream narrative around Mexican drug cartels and the cartel's relationship to Mexico's government has been the following. Mexico exists in what they call a, quote, post-political state. In other words, they claim that Mexico has been so decimated by corruption that it does not have an actual government anymore. The lack of a government or state has created a political vacuum that drug cartels have since stepped in to fill and have in turn become the true rulers of the Mexican state. In some circles, this process has been attributed to the massive structural and economic decimation suffered by neoliberal policies and exploitation. Zavala argues that while neoliberalism has had a very real devastating effect on Mexico and its working class, the Mexican state has actually historically held and continues to hold power over the country in all of its operations. In many instances, according to Zavala, drug trafficking gangs operate in a subservient manner to Mexico's political ruling elite, not the other way around. Okay, let's get into some of the history behind Mexican drug policy. Now, for those who aren't super familiar with Mexican politics, Mexico was under the rule of a single political party, the PRI, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party, for the majority of its time as an independent nation. Following the end of what we refer to as the Mexican Revolution and a decade of back-to-back rulings by revolutionary generals, the PRI ran Mexican politics and government for a little over 7 consecutive decades. And what I mean by they ran Mexican politics and government, they filled the presidential office and congressional majority during that period. So that's 7 consecutive decades from about 1929 to 2000. And during this period, the PRI upheld a very brutal and repressive regime. The PRI also held a very tight control of all aspects of Mexican trade, economy, and society. This included drug trafficking. The PRI initially viewed their control of drug trafficking operations as more of a sign of state power and authority. Drug traffickers acting in accordance with PRI directives, so that meant transporting and selling where they were allowed to, avoiding violent conflicts with competitors, paying required taxes and bribes to designated officials, all of that. So essentially, those who followed these rules were supported in their business, while those who defied or operated outside of PRI arrangements were swiftly punished. As mentioned earlier, the PRI was a very oppressive ruling party, but the majority of state suppression was directed towards forms of political subversion more than just organized crime. So this included leftist movements and peasants, students, teachers protesting, anyone who posed as a political threat or some form of upheld some form of political subversion. So this all peaked with a string of violent incidents that occurred in the late 60s and early 70s during a massive wave of protests that were occurring throughout Mexico. But it also continued up through the 90s. To quote Zavala here, "The main point to understand here is that state violence, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was carried out by a repressive apparatus under the aegis of political conflicts that threatened the integrity of the ruling elite. In other words, until the mid-1990s, the Mexican state confronted domestic conflicts as problems of opposition and resistance with a strictly political root, not as the permanent threat and opposition to the state that organized crime now represents." This, of course, was all happening during the Cold War. But as the Cold War came to an end, And as the world began to shift into its neoliberal era, United States policy, and in turn Mexican policy, given United States uh, hegemonic rule, uh, their policy around national security started to shift. So in 1986, Reagan signed Presidential Directive 221, designating drug trafficking as the new threat to United States national security. At the same time, Mexico started to develop its own security agenda around narco-trafficking. The two significant political developments in Mexico connected to this are the dissolution of the Federal Security Directorate, the DFS, in 1985, and the creation of its replacement, the Center for Investigation, the Center for Investigation and National Security, the Centro Nacional de Inteligencia, the CISEN, in 1989. Essentially, the dismantling of the DFS meant the dismantling of the structures that had prior allowed the Mexican federal government to control drug trafficking groups and operations, as I explained just a moment ago. While the CISEN would later play a key role in designating drug trafficking as a national security threat that required police and military intervention. In other words, the CISEN helped implement U.S. agenda around narco trafficking within Mexico. Okay, in 1994, Ernesto Zedillo took office as the last president of the PRI's 7-decade rule, and under him, the government started using armed forces to eradicate drug trafficking groups. Then, in 2000, that 71-year streak of consecutive rule was broken as National Action Party candidate Vicente Fox, so he was from the PAN party, took office. Now, as unprecedented as this was, the PAN proved to be just as exploitative as its predecessor, as it bore similar centrist right-wing politics and used very similar forms of rule. Fox also continued the PRI's recent shift in drug policies. Under ongoing pressure by the United States government, now in the post-9/11 political environment, the Mexican government established a national security policy that placed organized crime as its central target. This happened gradually, though. So at the beginning, the Fox administration framed drug trafficking as, quote, purely a police matter. That is, something that had neither the ability nor the intention to destabilize the state. But following a series of high-level meetings with U.S. officials, that narrative changed to one of national security. This all culminated in the infamous urban military and police mobilizations under President Felipe Calderón, who took office in 2006 and stayed in until 2012. Calderón began his war on drugs on December 11th, 2006, with his first deployment of Mexican armed forces to manage the supposed drug trafficking crisis in Michoacán. He then later extended this to many other states across the country. Calderón justified this ramp up of militarized interventions by claiming that violence had significantly increased due to organized crime. However, national homicide rates had actually been on a slow and steady decline over the past 2 decades, and following this period of militarized intervention, that decrease was drastically reversed, specifically in the areas where the Army and federal police had been deployed. So, in other words, this really isn't just a matter of militarized interventionism being ineffective. The militarized intervention actually created the very problem that it was supposed to resolve. You can see the numbers here. Homicide rates during Calderón's presidency increased to 121,683 in total during that period of his presidency. So that's 4 times the number of victims from Argentina's dirty war during the military dictatorships in the 1970s and 1980s. There have also been reported close to 30,000 disappearances during his presidency. It's a lot. Zavala argues that the adoption of United States national security discourse had a very specific political purpose. one that mainly served United States interests, but also obviously was in the interests of some of Mexico's ruling elites. Uh, yeah, March 13th, 2007, U.S. President Bush agreed to support Mexican President Calderon in the Mexican government's war against narco-trafficking. So Bush and Calderon have a meeting, and afterwards, Calderon initially outwardly stated that he asked for their financial support and that he needed that support in managing the cartel crisis. However, a source close to Calderon later on claimed that Calderon, in confidence, had revealed to him that the United States had forced him into adopting their war language and aggressive policies against narco-trafficking. Following this meeting, the Bush administration initiated the Merida Initiative, uh, and through that initiative, the United States would provide in total $2.3 billion in combat training and equipment for the Mexican armed forces to support their management of the supposed crisis. This initiative was also continued under Obama, by the way. But we still haven't really answered why the United States has been so invested in the war on drugs. So on that note, Zavala suggests that U.S. motivations have centered mostly around the exploitation of Mexico's hydrocarbon resources. Surprise, surprise. It all goes back to the gas and oil reserves, of course. Here, Zavala cites a 2014 study by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy on the hydrocarbon boom in northeastern Mexico. Quoting Zavala here, the Burgos Basin, which crosses the states of Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Coahuila. I'm so sorry, I am butchering these names. So yeah, the Burgos Basin, which crosses these three states, has become one of the main areas in the world for hydrocarbon exploration, extraction, and refining. With the fall in oil prices and the gradual dismantling of Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, you'll want to remember this, by the way. The Felipe Calderon and Enrique Peña Nieto, the follow-up president to Calderon in 2012, governments promoted an energy reform that would grant private and foreign interests that enormous wealth that had yet to be exploited. As Correa and Payan noted, Mexico actually ranks fourth in the world in natural shale gas reserves. Okay, a little bit of historical context here. In 1938, then President Cardenas made the oil expropriation decree, which essentially involved the state purchasing and taking of the oil fields, machinery, refineries, distribution stations, pipelines, basically all physical assets connected to oil extraction in Mexico. Cardenas purchased this from 17 foreign companies that had prior controlled the industry. So through that expropriation act, the Mexican state was able to reclaim its own resources and profits and set significant limitations to the transnational exploitation through which foreign imperial powers had profited. In other words, this decree led to the creation of So on top of setting those restrictions, this decree led to the creation of state-owned company Pemex, as I just mentioned a moment ago. Calderon's and Nieto's energy reforms from 2008 to 2018 weakened these restrictions and freed back up the oil and gas reserves for foreign investment and profit. Now, the study mentioned earlier also noticed a curious detail about the Burgos Basin. While U.S. and Mexican authorities claim that the cartel Los Zetas, you remember that photo at the beginning, the mountain with the Z and the drug cartel in front? Yeah, Los Zetas. So while American and Mexican authorities claim that Los Zetas controlled the resource-rich territories in the Burgos Basin, the Mexican government, under Nieto at that time, was still financing investment projects and had they were still financing investment projects and had increased public spending on the transportation of infrastructure into those regions. Zavala references three journalist accounts which elucidate on a peculiar pattern in which, first, Mexican armed forces are deployed to a supposedly drug and violence-ridden region that, in actuality, had been on a steady decline in homicide rates. Second, the region becomes decimated by militarized intervention and levels of homicide and violence skyrocket. Third, inhabitants of that region are forced to flee and become refugees. And fourth and finally, the region, though supposedly controlled by cartels and organized crime, is opened up for resource extraction from foreign capital interests via projects funded by the Mexican government. So, once again, quoting Zavala here, there is no cartel war, these journalists say, but rather transnational corporations laying siege, along with the interested cooperation of the Mexican political class. Not surprisingly, the energy reforms under Calderon and Nieto were promoted by the Obama administration. And WikiLeaks has even shown that Department of State Hillary Clinton offered direct assistance to free up oil and gas reserves for transnational corporate exploitation. So this all led to the cross-border hydrocarbon deposit agreement between Mexico and the United States in July 2014, which reversed Cardenista's long-standing oil expropriation law and thereby opened oil and natural gas to transnational corporations, like ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron. And according to one estimate, the border of the United States and Mexico has up to 172 trillion barrels worth of crude oil and 304 trillion cubic feet of natural gas deposits. That's a lot. Of course, Trump continued this legacy of influencing Mexican energy reform with further extractivist policies. But despite his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Paris Agreement on climate change, his extractivist interventions have actually been quite similar to that of Obama. Okay, let's talk about AMLO. So, as some of you may know, a lot has changed since the inauguration of Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in 2018. He also is known affectionately as, of course, AMLO. So let's first take a look at some of his administration's successes and why he has been so beloved in his country. I gathered most of the information here from a presentation that journalist Jose Luis Ceja recently did. I'm not sure if by the time this gets out, the event will have already happened or not, but if it hasn't, for those who don't know, we're hosting one of Jose Luis's stops for his national speaking tour on February 4th, 2024. This will be at Cesar Chavez Library from 2 to 4 p.m. You'll find details in our DSA calendar. I'll try to make sure that there's a link to that event in the description for the video, but I really do hope you can come check him out. Jose Luis will go into greater detail on all the changes under AMLO and get into a lot of the specifics about the recent tensions between US and Mexico and United States recent acts of aggression. Should be a really good talk. But for now, why don't we take a look at this? So under AMLO, we have seen a near doubling of Mexico's minimum wage, an increase in food assistance programs, new unconditional direct cash programs, increases in student scholarships, ton of pensions for seniors. These are just a small number of things that have been accomplished under him. There's a lot of other cool stuff happening with like labor unions and such. But one study did find that 71% of Mexican households have benefited from one of the social resource programs under his administration. So you can really see why the Mexican people love AMLO so much. Okay, on January 30th, 2018, having just been elected, AMLO announced an end to the war on drugs. And by that, he meant an end to the an end to the militarized conflict started under President Calderon. So, under AMLO's transitional team, the Mexican government began its National Plan for Peace and Security. And under this, drug trafficking and addiction would be treated as a public health issue instead of a national security threat, with a focus on providing health resources for addiction and addressing root causes for the drug problem. So that includes stuff like poverty, addressing root causes like poverty, unemployment, educational needs, basic living needs, a lot of the stuff that I just named a moment ago under his successes. And on the other side of this, the AMLO administration has severely limited United States law enforcement agencies and United States security force roles in drug trafficking interventions. He dissolved the sensitive investigative unit, which had been trained by and collaborated heavily with the DEA, and he significantly limited DEA operations in Mexico as well. As indicated in the afterword of this text, AMLO also reframed the national security crisis as not one of drug cartel violence, but one of national resource theft by transnational corporations and the Mexican business elite. This is part of AMLO's new nationalization efforts, but the new nationalization project extends beyond oil and gas. So in April 2022, AMLO officially nationalized its lithium resources, and the following year started purchasing previously Spanish-owned electricity power plants. Now, recall from earlier the cross-border hydrocarbon deposit and how this agreement, the cross-border hydrocarbon deposit agreement, and how this agreement under Nieto ended Cardenista's legacy of oil expropriation, opening up transnational exploitation of Mexico's oil and gas resources. So one of the main areas of focus for AMLO's campaign has been the reclamation of national sovereignty. And there's been a particular focus on how that sense of national sovereignty connects to energy resources and production. So under AMLO, the Mexican government launched an ambitious program to recover the national oil industry. So this included the rolling back of international exploitation of Mexico's oil reserves, a decrease in oil imports, and a massive increase in oil processing in Mexican refineries. Just this last year, in 2023, AMLO announced that by the end of 2024, Mexico will stop gasoline and oil imports entirely and become completely self-reliant, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Not many nations do that. The United States government has, of course, not been happy about any of this. Per one Reuters report, the Biden administration, in response to these, quote, isolationist efforts, gave the Mexican government an ultimatum to either open their energy markets or face trade tariffs, as Mexico, according to Biden, has violated the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement by, quote, favoring state oil companies, Pemex, as well as the CFE power utility, that's the electric power companies that the state purchased from Spanish-owned corporations. And I love this part, discriminating against U.S. companies. So dumb. However, as we are about to see, trade tariffs may be the least of Mexico's worries when it comes to United States interventions. Okay, in wrapping this up and tying all of it back to the current U.S. imperialist threats, I'd like to play a quick game of some of you may be familiar with, known in social media as Shot Chaser. So how this works, I'm going to show one headline that might be a little difficult to swallow. It's like a shot, as it were. And then I'm going to follow it up with something a little easier to digest, a chaser. Pretty simple, right? All right, here we go. Shot. Leaked documents reveal United States government is angry AMLO prioritizes social welfare over drug militarization. Chaser. All 6 Republican candidates fully support an invasion of Mexico. Shot. 77% of drug traffickers are actually United States citizens. Chaser. 86% of those smuggling fentanyl are, again, you guessed it, United States citizens. Shot. 0.02% of migrants crossing the border have been found with fentanyl. And in light of some of our more recent events, shot. Texas deploys state agents and razor wire at Mexican border in defiance of Supreme Court. Shot. Republican governors send troops to Texas for support amid Civil War fears. Shot. Protest convoy heading to the southern border calls itself an Army of God. Shot. Booming United States gun business arms Mexican cartels. Shot. San Jose Police Union executive caught smuggling bulk fentanyl into the United States. Yeah, in case you haven't noticed, it's a little difficult to tell the difference between a shot and a chaser here. It's kind of all bad. Okay, last call. Just give it a moment here.
Do some things. Something has to be done. Look, we're losing, I think, 300,000 people.
But let me ask you, I get it, and I see to you that there's a serious problem that
No, we're losing more money than if we were actually in a war.
But
Not money.
a lot of the
Money
Republicans
and
are saying
lives.
they're going to do this.
We're losing more lives. If we were in a war, we wouldn't be losing, because I believe the number is 300,000.
But we can't have a war with Mexico.
No, it's a war on cartels. Mexico's petrified of the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico.
But if we send our troops across the southern border, you know better than I do.
Well,
that the Mexican president, if he doesn't like it, we're in a war.
I know, but well, I'm not too worried about that war. No, Mexico is sending their troops into our country in the form of illegal aliens that are killing people in many cases, that are causing lots of disease and lots of problems. You know, they're coming in. I had the medical barrier that Biden dropped. I had every barrier you could have. Even the judge said, "Are you sure you want to drop this? I don't think you should drop this. This is a..."
Yeah, you gotta love that Freudian slip there. We're losing more money than if we were actually at war. No, not money. Lives. Also worth noting the framing here. This is not a war with Mexico. It's with the cartels, who the Mexicans are, in fact, terrified of. So, of course, the implication being here that we would, in fact, be liberating the people of Mexico by invading Mexico and going to war with the people of Mexico. All right. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Thank you so much for joining and watching. Again, please do consider, if you're not already a member of East Bay DSA, the link will be in the description below. And yeah, also consider joining our the National Body's International Committee. There's a lot of great work happening there. But until next time, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, we'll see you soon. All right, take care. Solidarity.